By Father Zeus, Athene, and Apollo, if only I were young as I was when the fierce people of Pylos and the spearmen of Arcadia fought by the swift flowing waters of Celadon around the river of Dardanus besides the walls of Pheia. Foremost among them stood Ereuthalion, a godlike man, bearing upon his shoulders the armour of Lord Areithoos, mighty Areithoos, whom men and fine-girdled women alike used to call the club-bearer, because he fought not with a bow, nor with a great spear, but smashed his way through the phalanx with an iron club. But Lykourgos defeated him with trickery rather than strength in a narrow passageway in which his club could not ward off death. Lykourgos rushed him and skewered him with his spear, and he was thrown onto his back with no backup. Then Lykourgos stripped Areithoos' war gear, which brazen Ares himself had given to him. And when Lykourgos had grown old, still living in his palace, he bestowed his gear upon Ereuthalion, his trusty henchman. And bearing these arms, Ereuthalion challenged all the great men, and they all trembled in fear. No one dared except me. My indomitable spirit urged me to contend with him in valour, though I was the youngest of all of them. So I fought, and Athene granted me glory. That was the biggest, mightiest man I ever killed, and he lay sprawling everywhere. If only I were young, as I was back then. If only I still had all my strength, then blazing-crested Hector would soon meet his match. Those words are voiced by the aging Greek hero Nestor in Book 7 of the Iliad. Achilles has withdrawn from the fighting after his quarrel with Agamemnon, and the Trojans, led on the field by the hero Hector, have gained the upper hand. So Nestor tries to shame the younger Achaeans to take up the challenge. He, of course, is far too old to take on the hardiest fighter in the entire Trojan army. But when he was a wee lad, he took on the mighty Arcadian Ereuthalion. That's the dramatic context for the backstory of Ereuthalion and his predecessor, the club-wielding warrior Areithoos. I find this passage really interesting, most of all because I have no idea who these two characters are. They're so vividly described, but yet otherwise scarcely even heard of them. What I can say, however, is this. Nestor is famously an old man in the Iliad, 2 or even 3 generations older than the younger heroes. He was very young, so mid to late teens, I guess, when he fought and killed Ereuthalion. Ereuthalion must at that time have been a mature but still mighty man, vigorous enough to put fear into all of Nestor's older comrades, but old enough to have served the then aging Lykourgos long and well enough to inherit the armour which Lykourgos had himself won of Areithoos when, presumably, he was in the vigour of his own youth. That means that Nestor is speaking of fights between warriors 4 or even 5 generations older than the likes of Diomedes and Achilles. Now, I'm not so naive as to think one can be too literal about such mythological chronologies, and indeed, Iliad Book 7 itself is internally inconsistent with its own chronologies, because earlier in Book 7 the Trojan Paris kills the son of Areithoos, the club-bearer, exactly the same guy, which suggests that Areithoos is only of the previous generation. But whichever way one looks at it, the famously old Nestor is here speaking about his youth when he fought, and then alluding back to times long before even that. It's clear enough that the tales are intended to be throwbacks to an earlier age than the Trojan War. Now, if you've watched a few of these videos, in which case thank you, I really appreciate it, then you might figure that I'm kind of into fanciful romantic speculation about pre-literary eras. And yeah, whilst that's all very lightweight, I kind of like it. And this is going to be one of those videos. So this passage is a classic example of ring composition. I hesitate to say that because it sounds so trite to even mention the phrase ring composition. It's such an easy cliche. It reminds me of school days. But still, I think it's useful to observe here because the ring structure serves a very particular function. It allows for the sensitive handling of a flashback, or more so a flashback within a flashback. Now, flashbacks are notoriously difficult to write and are too often clunkily handled. You can tell that by how the idea of a flashback is so often the subject of parody in popular media today. It's not only difficult to go into a flashback with style, but coming out of one without making it appear entirely forced, obvious, and clunky is just as difficult. So there's nothing wrong with a flashback per se, and it's the sensitive handling of a flashback that separates the amateurs from the pros, the cringe from the kick-ass. Now, in this particular passage, Homer's use of ring composition enables the poet to enter into the flashback to Nestor's youth, then to go back a further generation, the besting of Areithoos, and then come back to Nestor's youth, and then to the time of the Iliad itself. Each layer of the ring structure is marked not so much by a concept or turn of phrase, but by a layer in the chronology, by the proximity of the relationship to the narrative context. And it does so all through natural incremental steps, no sudden transitions. Contrast the elegance of that structured approach to the cliched flashback format, in its modern parody versions where you go flashback, 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 wavy lines, and then at the end of the story there's an equally forced flash forward to the present day as the story picks back up from where it started. So who are the three characters of Nestor's tale? Beside himself, his foe Ereuthalion, Areithoos the Clubman, and Lykourgos, the guy who took the armor from the one and eventually passed it down to the other. I've done my best to research these guys, but save for one passing reference to each of Ereuthalion and Areithoos in the Iliad itself, I've failed to find any mention of either of these two in Greek epic or ancient poetry more general. There are a couple of references to the Arcadian king Lykourgos in Pausanias, but the name's so commonplace that he could be talking about any Arcadian king or ruler with that name. As for Areithoos, whose name I really can't pronounce, Clubman I mean, Pausanias in his description of Greece, Hilados Periegesis, Book 8, mentions a tomb of Areithoos somewhere in Arcadia near Mantinea, and he's mentioned in a fragmentary paraphrase of the historian Pherecydes. I'm not sure which one. There was a 6th century and a 5th century writer of the same name. All we have is a paraphrase given by a scholiast on the Iliad. Areithoos, the Boeotian, preeminent amongst his peers, made an incursion into Arcadia, for there was a boundary dispute between the Arcadians and the Boeotians. I think. I may just have mistranslated that because Arcadia and Boeotia aren't even neighbours. He made off with loads of booty. His invasion caused the enmity of the Arcadians, and Lykourgos, who was the most powerful man amongst the Arcadians, set an ambush and killed him. And he took all his war gear, including his club, and recovered all the spoils. That's the story, at least according to Pherecydes. But even that doesn't tell us much beyond what's already relatively apparent from Iliad Book 7, so much so that it feels that maybe Pherecydes is just taking all this from Homer, and that there's no independent source for this. Kirk speculates that in an earlier tale, Areithoos may have been a brigand, a bandit, on no particular grounds other than that his weapon, the club, with which he is so closely associated, seems out of place from the usual norms of Greek heroic warfare, and Heracles with his club doesn't count. Not least because it's difficult to see how a guy with a club would have managed to fight off spearmen, those who dominated later hoplite warfare and indeed Iliadic epic warfare alike. True, Homer's Nestor speaks of how Areithoos smashed his way through the phalanxes with his club, but that's not entirely convincing. The conundrum is solved if the character Areithoos was originally a brigand, a highwayman who somehow got accommodated into martial epic, or indeed if we're taking the view that Nestor is just making this shit up, something we can't entirely discount, and I'll come back to that later. As for Ereuthalion, I found absolutely zero references to him anywhere, at least not in any ancient texts, and if you're aware of any that I've just not been able to spot, Please tell us about it in the comments. So it's as if Ereuthalion appears in the tradition and then disappears without trace, without an express trace, that is. See, there are parallels for the encounter between Nestor and Ereuthalion in two of the most culturally significant literary works in world literature, the Aeneid and the Old Testament. Let's look at Virgil's Aeneid first. In this case, we can at least be pretty confident that any close parallels are inspired directly by the Iliad. The passage in question is Aeneid Book 8. The Trojan refugee Aeneas has arrived in Italy and is attempting to establish a new home for himself and his fellow Trojan refugees. He forms an alliance with the elder statesman Evander and his son Pallas, who will later be killed by the Latian champion Turnus. The aging Evander sends off his son to fight with Aeneas and expresses his regret that he is too old to go in his son's stead. Then Evander, clasping the hand of his departing son, clings to him, weeping insatiably, and thus speaks, "If only Jupiter would bring me back the years that are sped, and make me what I was, when under Praeneste's very walls I struck down the foremost ranks, burned the piled-up shields in my triumph, and with this right hand sent down to Tartarus King Erulus, whom at birth his mother Feronia had given, awful to tell, 3 lives, with 3-fold armour to wear. 3 times he had to be laid low in death, yet on that day this hand bereft him of all his lives, and as often stripped him of his armour. Then never should I now be torn, my son, from your sweet embrace." The thematic parallels between Virgil's Evander and Homer's Nestor are clear, kind of. Both are senior statesmen watching their sons and their sons' contemporaries go to war. Incidentally, though, unlike Evander, Nestor is an active fighter at Troy, though like Evander he suffers the tragedy of seeing his son die before him, though that takes place outside the Iliad in the Areithoos. Both Nestor and Evander look back to their youthful prowess, wishing that they had their former strength, though Nestor says this to shame the young'uns, Evander as an expression of regret, maybe even shame, that he has to send his son to war rather than fight himself. Both illustrate said youthful prowess by focusing on their besting of a singular champion endowed with some kind of unique might. Nestor's opponent Ereuthalion is preternaturally big and mighty and possesses strange war gear with a long and storied heritage originating from Ares himself. Evander's opponent Erulus has some kind of magic 3-fold life force and also has special armour. It's not the most obvious parallel, but hey. Now, one of the curious things about Aeneas' relationship with Evander is that the latter, Evander, is Greek, and Aeneas is a refugee from Troy, who of course has just been defeated by the Greeks or Achaeans. But perhaps their interests are more aligned than one might think. Perhaps they shared a common enemy. See, Evander is Greek, yet more specifically he is an Arcadian. The Ereuthalion episode that Nestor speaks of in Iliad VII tells of wars between the armies of Pylos, for whom the young Nestor fought, and the Arcadians. Nestor and Evander, the Arcadian, are representatives of an older generation to the younger heroes of the Iliad and Aeneid. So perhaps, as McPhee speculates, the two, Nestor and Evander, fought on opposite sides. Perhaps Evander was present at the battle in which Nestor slayed Ereuthalion. Pure speculation, fantasy even, but it's a nice thought. The other famous, far more famous, shall I say, parallel to young Nestor's victory over the massive champion Ereuthalion is the young future king David's victory over Goliath in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament first book of Samuel. David versus Goliath passage is far more expansive than the Nestor versus Ereuthalion and the Evander versus Erulus episodes, both of which are of comparative length. So I shan't read it out, not least because I'd be doing the Bible a disservice by not displaying it up on screen here in Hebrew, of which I cannot read a word. word. But the core elements are well known. Now, many commentators have noted the notional similarities between the two episodes. And in fact, actually, if you Google Ereuthalion, the only things that come up are Goliath, basically. But of all those many comparisons, I'll quote one of my favourite classical scholars, M.L. West, from his East Face of Helicon. Here the parallels with David and Goliath are all the more noticeable, as the defeated warrior Ereuthalion is characterised as a giant, and he wields a distinctive weapon, an iron club, which recalls the massive iron head of Goliath's spear. He came forward in his armour and challenged all the opposing heroes to fight him. The rest were afraid, but Nestor, the youngest of Neleus' 12 sons, as David is the youngest of Jesse's 8, accepted the challenge and with divine support killed the man and left him sprawled on the ground. The event, i.e. Nestor versus Ereuthalion, is located at a river Yardanos, which later commentators could not find. This has been suspected of reflecting an original which referred to the Jordan. The connection between the river Yardanos, mentioned by Nestor but otherwise unattested, and the river Jordan is, to me, the most compelling link. Otherwise, I'm not too convinced. Personally, I don't see the two passages as being that similar. Most of the touch points mentioned above, a young man who would go on to great things, taking on a mighty enemy champion, so generic as to be unremarkable as coincidences. The narrative frame is also very different, unlike, for example, the Evander and Erulus passage from the Aeneid, which is at least voiced by an old king looking back on his youth and recounting the episode in first person, just like Nestor, but not like the David and Goliath passage. But for the sake of argument, let's go with the idea that there is some kind of literary affiliation between 1 Samuel and Iliad VII. That begs the question, who's alluding to whom? That in turn raises the question which text was written first, though the mere fact that one text is less ancient than the other in no way proves that it was inspired or based on the earlier text. They might be inspired by a third source, or this might just all be a coincidence, which I think it might be. It's not definitively agreed which of the two texts, the Iliad and the first book of Samuel, is earlier, and of course one can't pinpoint the date of any of them to a particular single point in time anyway. But, I'm not sufficiently au fait with biblical philology to even attempt to form a view myself. So I'll shortcut it and I'll just refer instead to a paper by and Wright in the Journal of Biblical Literature, wherein they conclude, to the best of our knowledge, no one has so far convincingly demonstrated or even tried to trace imitation of the Iliad or the Odyssey in the Hebrew Bible, apart from 1 Samuel 17, and with no analogies to it, alleged Homeric mimesis in 1 Samuel 17 presents itself as a unique and therefore improbable phenomenon. The parallels between 1 Samuel 17 and the Iliad are best attributable to accidental convergence, common dependence on ancient Near Eastern literary classics, most of whose oeuvre predate both Homer and the Hebrew Bible by centuries if not millennia, or diffusion of motifs, tropes and concepts. Chances are that the biblical chapter absorbed and transformed, in Christopher's words, elements of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of I can't say it. And thus, unbeknownst to the Bible's readers until less than 2 centuries ago, channeled these texts into Western culture. I agree on the far less erudite and sophisticated grounds that the Iliadic and biblical passages just aren't that similar, save in most generic terms. Though I do find the reference to the river Yardanos tantalizing. So all in all, Nestor's account in Book 7 seems isolated, with no other tradition built up around it. The scant references that there are to these characters in later literature are so scarce that they might as well, in fact probably are, just taken directly from the Iliad itself. There's certainly no solid evidence of a parallel independent mythology or history about these guys. It's as if character Ereuthalion appeared from nowhere and then disappeared without a trace. So what are the possibilities? Is Ereuthalion an invention of the Homeric poet? And indeed, is Ereuthalion an invention of the character Nestor? So let's take these two questions. By questioning whether Ereuthalion is an invention of Homer, I mean, was the character and the incident made up by the Homeric poets invented as a backstory for Nestor, as opposed to being taken from an earlier or contemporaneous folklore tradition, or even based on a real story. Now that's something of a false dichotomy, I grant you, because depending on your stance on the Homeric question, who, what, and how many was Homer, one can characterize Homer as a tradition of epic poets of themselves, which makes the notion of anything being a invention without precedent something of a nonsense, because of course any previous tellings of the Iliad featuring that story would be a tradition in itself. So I guess what I mean by an invention of Homer, I mean a character or episode that has no independent or extraneous existence outside the Iliadic tradition. In this regard, the fact that the story of Ereuthalion is backstory set several generations prior to the Trojan War in Arcadia is significant. The character and story is extraneous to the immediate context, which to me at least implies that the character did exist outside of the Iliadic tradition, or at least that he is presented so as to seem as such. In other words, if he was invented within the Iliadic tradition, then that almost feels like a deception upon the audience. Which brings us to the other question, is Ereuthalion an invention of Nestor's? Meaning that within the dramatic context of the Iliad, is the character Nestor making up this story? Is he bullshitting his Achaean audience, telling tall tales? Now, neither question is fully dependent on the other, nor are they entirely independent. Although in a way that I can't quite articulate, except maybe by drawing up this little table on an axis, I feel that if we knew, or if we could be confident about the answers to each of the two questions, that might impact how we view and receive the passage. So say, if there existed a Nestor versus Ereuthalion tradition outside of the Iliad, and if within the dramatic context at hand, Nestor is recounting a true tale of his youth, then to me that's like an insight into a glimpse of an entire lost epic tradition. Kind of like a franchise crossover, where a character familiar in one guise in setting A introduces or is introduced to an entirely different aspect of himself from another alien setting B. Nestor is famous in the Iliad and indeed in the Odyssey as that old man, yet his younger self, a very different Nestor, intrudes into the Iliad in this passage. It has indeed been speculated that there may have existed an entire epic Nestorian tradition, a Nestor cycle, which has mostly been lost, save for the occasional intrusions into the Iliad. One finds these kind of interpolations and crossovers in modern story franchises like Batman versus Superman, I guess. The characters for the most part existing independently of each other. The analogue here, though, is less a case of two characters, but of an old version of a character and a young version of a character. And then it's like a major franchise event when the two are brought in together in one setting. Actually, I've not seen Batman versus Superman, and I'm really not that into DC and Marvel stuff too much, so my main point of reference is going back to watching in the 1980s The Adventures of He-Man or whatever, and I can remember an episode when She-Ra turned up in the middle of a He-Man episode. For some reason it was just really impactful for me, so much so that I remember that scene nearly 40 years later, even though I can't remember any of the other plot lines of those old cartoons. Now I'm about to stray into an entirely different theme here, one which I may or may not cover sometime, but I'm kind of interested in how the means and methods by which folklore, myth, and other such public domain stories in a pre-modern era were fashioned into literary epics, and how that differs from the way in which modern commercial IP franchises function. That's something I'd really like to dig into sometime, though I don't quite feel equipped to handle it. I'm just as weak, you see, on pop culture franchises as I am on literary theory, cultural anthropology, and other things what are way too complex for an idiot like me. Now, if at the opposite axis the Ereuthalion episode is an invention of the Homeric poets, and in the dramatic context is supposed to be just a tall story made up by Nestor, then that brings in its own kind of dynamic. Quite what that dynamic would be, however, would depend upon how familiar most of the original audience, if you can ever speak of an original audience, would have been with the other myths and folklore that are quoted in the Iliad. Because we could have a situation wherein the audience would have been generally familiar with all the stories that are alluded to by the Homeric epic, so that usually when you get a reference to some other character or events outside the main narrative context, people go, oh yeah, I know that story, that's cool. So if that happens most of the time, then when the audience hear Nestor tell this tall tale, they go, Zeus, don't know what the hell Nestor is on about, he's clearly making it up. On the other hand, there must be a chance that many of the people in Homer's original audience, again, if you can ever talk about a, quote, original audience, wouldn't necessarily have recognized every tale, every allusion, every piece of lore, as the kids call it, L-O-R-E, to which the epic refers. I can imagine that happening, especially in the phase of epic's development where it had moved out of Ionia and had become a kind of a pan-Hellenic thing, taking in all kinds of traditions from all over the Greek-speaking world. I can really imagine then that people would have no idea who a lot of these myths and stories are. But anyway, in that kind of situation, they might have been in no better or worse place to unpick this passage than we are today even. They, like us, might not know if this is a made-up story, and indeed if Nestor is therefore bullshitting everybody or not. It's a very sort of different dynamic at play. As for the possibility that the tale is not an invention of Homer, it comes from an extraneous tradition, but in the dramatic context it is a tall tale for Nestor. Well, that's a whole other different way of thinking about it. It strikes me as a somewhat less likely scenario, insofar as there is no express indication in the text that Nestor is supposed to be making it up. So if he says it, it kind of must be true, absent evidence in the epic to the contrary. And there is none. No, wait, I say there is none, but the fact that earlier in Book 11, Areithoos is described as the father of one of the people that Paris kills. Well, that, I mentioned earlier, is like a sort of a chronological disconnect here, because of course in the Nestor story, Areithoos is sort of several generations earlier still. So yeah, that actually, now that I think about it, is an example of where there might be a hint in the text itself that Nestor is talking shit. But there's the other remaining possibility. That's that the story is an invention of Homer, but in the dramatic context it is intended to be a true story told by Nestor. In a way, that feels to me like the least likely of options. For a modern author, that would be off par for the course. Inventing an invented character's backstory is unremarkable. For a modern writer, of course. But it seems to me that for a pan-Hellenic epic, of the kind that the Iliad had become by the time it reached its mature state, that the authors don't just make stuff up out of nowhere. Every side character and every little bit of detail comes from somewhere, more so perhaps than even some of the main plot events of the Iliad, which might actually be written in order to explain the immediate action at hand. And also, with such a large body of local legends available, why would a poet make it up? Unless, if the Ereuthalion episode and the David and Goliath episode do indeed have a common Near Eastern ancestor, then the poet may have heard, whether first or second hand, a story originating from the Middle East perhaps, of a young future king taking on the mightiest, biggest, baddest guy around, and he felt inspired to adapt that to a Hellenic context, and in the absence of other models, used this tale of Nestor as an opportunity to spin it. I also here ought to quote M.M. Wilcock, who in a series of articles went on about mythological paradigma, as he called them in the Iliad, and indeed he has a brief footnote on the Ereuthalion episodes, where he says that a speech by Nestor about his youthful prowess offered a convenient opportunity for the invention of the poet. So, but my favourite theory, favourite insofar as it's the theory that I would want to believe because it would be cool, would be that the Ereuthalion episode is an echo of an otherwise lost archaic epic tradition, a Nestor cycle, for example. And better still, that it is an echo of a much earlier phase of oral poetry, as hinted by the fact that Nestor, a character from a generation earlier than even the legendary youthful heroes of the Iliad, is himself recounting tales of generations earlier even than he. But that is pure romantic wishful thinking, I grant you. Now, one might query what the whole point of this is. All this speculation is unprovable one way or another, since, allowing for the possible exception of the theogony, the Iliad is the earliest Greek literature available to us, so there's no way of telling whether any particular components of it were a new invention or not. Nor would any subsequent references to a tale or cultic inspiration tell us anything one way or the other, because even if the Iliadic episode were a complete new fabrication, then that wouldn't stop a later author from referencing it, because, well, once it's in the Iliad, it's legit, no question. So really, it's is all very pointless, except insofar as it got me thinking about how the epic tradition may have formed. And I grant you, one can pick pretty much any episode in the Iliad and apply much the same logic. So why choose this one story? Well, ultimately, it's just because it just grabbed me. It's a cool story. And indeed, I thought it was so cool, and I thought the character of Ereuthalion sounded so cool that I was going to just follow through for this video all the other references to him. But when I couldn't find any, I just thought, why? Why has nobody ever spoken? Why don't we have later sources for this? None of which, of course, answers any questions about the origins of the tale. And hey, that's all part of the mystery, the sense of a lost, a never quite knowable tradition. That, in large part, is what draws me to archaic epic in the first place. But there is a coda to Nestor's tale of Ereuthalion, or more properly, his predecessors Lykourgos and Areithoos. It's a very recent or recently discovered one. About a decade or so, a fragmentary bronze tablet resurfaced. I think it came to the light in the London Antiquities Market. I can't find the reference now. It turned out to be a 5th or 6th century BC festival calendar, probably originating from Arcadia, which is where Nestor's tales of Ereuthalion, Lykourgos and Areithoos are set. It was published in 2015 by Homeric in a book collection. Not actually managed to consult that book. And very soon thereafter published and translated again by Carbon and Claxon in a more readily accessible journal, which I have consulted. Anyway, Kyle Marney wrote a interesting paper on the tablet called The New Arcadian Festival Calendar and Iliad VII on Lykourgos and Areithoos. The tablet describes various cultic activities and celebrations associated with the 3-day-long festival, which took place every 9 years. The opening section seems to describe some kind of arming and war dance ritual or procession taking place on the first day of the festival, like a coming-of-age or confirmation ritual for young warriors. Arcadia, incidentally, was famed for its mercenaries, in some periods at least, probably because there was sod all else for a guy to do other than play panpipes and tend sheep. The text implies, or could be read as implying, that this ritual took place at a location called Coronation, but where or what that place actually is disputed. Marney notes that Heinrich, who originally published the tablet, thinks that the word Coronation is associated with the word Coryphi, peak, i.e. the ritual takes place on a mountain, probably Mount Lycaon. But Marney argues that the word derives from korune, or club, via the agent noun koronitas, club-bearer, and recall that Areithoos is called the club-bearer, koronetes, twice in Iliad VII. Thus, the ritual described in the tablet might be associated with the story of how Areithoos himself was bested by Lykourgos in a trap, and how Lykourgos took his armour and then later passed it down. So with that, the paper concludes, accordingly I suggest that the ritual or rituals that involved arms and occurred on the first day of the festival cycle, in which the Coronation features prominently, have some connection with the story of Areithoos, Lykourgos and Ereuthalion, a version of which most probably served as its etiology. Just as Lykourgos acquired his armour after slaying Areithoos through a trick and subsequently passed it on to his servant, so the young men were presented with a red military cloak, and at least one of the youths did something with arms and armour. Indeed, the list of arms and armour is cut off at the end of line 6 at Kappa. It is not unreasonable to suggest the supplement of Karunan, the Arcadian form for club. The armour brought out may very well have been ascribed to Areithoos and Lykourgos. I'm not a sufficiently competent philologist to assess that claim, but hey, if it's so, then that is very cool. But still no mention of Ereuthalion, who remains very much a man of mystery, whom, insofar as I can tell, makes no further appearance in the extant classical literary tradition, save possibly in transmuted form as the young Evander's opponent Erulus. So here's to lost epic antagonists, and to all the many other epic antagonists and protagonists of whom no trace, not even an aside, remains. Who else, I wonder, did young Nestor battle, whom he hasn't already told us about in the Iliad? Who knows? Maybe someone will find a lost epic fragment in all those burnt scrolls from Herculaneum or whatever, or from the still not fully deciphered rubbish dumps of Oxyrhynchus. Next time, well, I don't know, might get a bit grimdark. Till then, like and subscribe, and ring the notification bell or whatever it's called, and we'll be back soon.